On Thursday, April 24th, 2026, the Trump administration published a formal notice in the U.S. Federal Register aimed squarely at Canadian and Mexican steel and aluminum companies. The message was blunt: move your production to the United States, and we will give you tariff relief immediately. The White House framed it as an opportunity, a lifeline for struggling producers. But within 72 hours, instead of a rush of Canadian factories relocating south, the reaction was the opposite of what Washington expected. To understand why, you must first grasp the scale of the pressure already in place. Since June 2025, the United States had imposed a 50% tariff on Canadian steel. That was no rounding error. It was a wall. Canada had exported roughly $24 billion worth of steel and aluminum to the U.S. in 2024, representing 23% of all American steel imports and nearly 60% of all American aluminum imports. Nearly 90% of Canada's steel and aluminum exports flowed to a single customer, the United States. By imposing a 50% tariff, Washington did not merely inconvenience Canadian industry. It surgically targeted the most vulnerable point of Canada's manufacturing economy. Now, after more than a year under this pressure, the Trump administration published a formal pathway for Canadian producers to seek relief from those tariffs. But there was a catch. Companies had to commit to building or expanding production capacity inside the United States. Tariff relief was not a favor. It was a transaction. Relief today in exchange for expanding American industrial capacity tomorrow. This was the architecture of the offer, and U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick put it plainly: make your products at home, and you will avoid tariffs. On paper, it sounded clean, simple, logical. In practice, Canadian industry leaders spent the next 48 hours explaining why it could not work. John Seymour, CEO of the Aluminium Association of Canada, did not hide his reaction. He called the proposal unfeasible for the aluminum sector and said it did not make economic sense. The reasoning was straightforward. Billions of dollars in capital investment were required for facilities whose profitability depends entirely on where metal prices land years from now. Nobody could predict that. Building a billion-dollar smelter on a promise of tariff relief that could be revoked at any moment was unthinkable. He described the math as fuzzy. Catherine Cobden, president and CEO of the Canadian Steel Producers Association, added another reality. A steel plant is not a laptop. You cannot pick it up and move it. A plant represents up to $1 billion or more in fixed assets. You cannot shutter it and walk away. Capital does not follow promises. It is already poured into the concrete. International trade lawyer William Pellerin, representing companies navigating U.S. tariffs, described the offer even more bluntly: a very aggressive tactic with a precise strategic logic. The United States framed it as "we win if you lose." It did not promise both countries could thrive. It said, Canadian companies wanting access to their primary market must contribute to American industrial capacity to secure it. This was not traditional trade policy. It was industrial extraction dressed up as a relief program. The timing only amplified the tension. The notice arrived during a week described by Canadian officials as tense, with both sides publicly airing grievances, a diplomatic way to describe a relationship already strained since last October, when trade talks on steel and aluminum, reportedly close to a breakthrough, were abruptly halted. Prime Minister Mark Carney's trade minister, Dominic LeBlanc, acknowledged that in October, Canada had been very close to an agreement that would have provided significant relief to the steel and aluminum sectors. There was even an interesting offer on energy on the table, but Trump personally told his negotiators to halt discussions, angered by an advertisement the Ontario government ran during the World Series. That was where formal negotiations ended, setting the stage for the arrival of this new offer. The human cost of the tariffs was already visible. By March 2025, when the first round of tariffs hit, hundreds of Canadian workers in steel and aluminum had received layoff notices. Aloma Steel and Sault Ste. Marie laid off employees, warning that more could follow if new Canadian customers were not found. Avaco Rolling Mills in eastern Ontario sent 30 permanent layoff notices, with additional cuts looming. The United Steelworkers Union warned that full tariffs could eventually impact 100,000 of their members. One shredder operator at an Ontario plant described the uncertainty of not knowing week to week if he would have work, while caring for a 2-year-old daughter at home. These were the people most directly touched by the tariff war, and they would also be the last to benefit from a deal requiring production to relocate abroad. Canada's response to the new offer was not a counter-proposal. It was a strategic shift in a different direction. On the very day the U.S. notice was published, Prime Minister Carney publicly dismissed the tariff relief proposal, calling the 50% tariffs on steel and aluminum a violation of the existing free trade agreement. He made clear that relocation to the United States did not represent a reasonable business decision for Canadian producers. His words at a press conference were pointed: "You know what an irritant is? A 50% tariff on steel and aluminum. Those are violations of our trade deal." That same afternoon, Carney coordinated with Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum to align a joint approach ahead of the formal USMCA review scheduled for summer. While Washington tried to pitch Canadian companies to defect from their home market, Ottawa was building a continental counterweight with Mexico City. 2 days later, Carney unveiled a 24-member advisory committee on Canada-U.S. economic relations, chaired by Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc, and composed of former premiers, party leaders from conservative and liberal backgrounds, and senior executives from mining, steel, banking, rail, energy, and agriculture. The first meeting was scheduled for April 27th. The committee's composition was a clear signal. This was not a crisis management panel, but a negotiating infrastructure for a prolonged economic confrontation. The trade war did not remain confined to trade lanes. It spread into the behavior of 38 million Canadian consumers and travelers. And the economic blowback now hit American businesses and workers in ways no tariff revenue could offset. Statistics Canada. Data released in April 2026 revealed that Canadians driving to the United States were down 35% compared to March 2024, before tensions escalated. Air travel from Canada to the U.S. fell 14% year over year in March 2026 alone, marking the 13th consecutive month of year-over-year declines. Across all of 2025, Canadian visits to the U.S. dropped 21%, representing 4.2 million fewer visitors and an estimated $4.5 billion in lost spending. The U.S. Travel Association calculated total 2025 tourism losses from absent Canadian travelers at $5.7 billion. The geography of that damage was specific and severe. Florida lost approximately 500,000 Canadian visitors in 2025, nearly 15% of its market. Las Vegas saw a 24% drop in Canadian arrivals. California reported an 18.6% decrease as of February 2026. In New Hampshire, campground reservations fell 71% in the first 5 months of 2025. One Montana hotel lost $38,000 in a single cancellation when a Canadian sports team walked away from a 70-room, 200-person dinner reservation. A business owner in Maine described 2025 as the worst year he had ever seen. A shop owner at a U.S.-Canada border crossing said business had dropped over 80%, forcing a reduction from 20 staff to a skeleton crew of 3 or 4 within a single season. A Democratic-led congressional report called the damage to border states real and mounting. Analysis by a Center for Economic Policy Research found that by mid-2025, businesses most dependent on Canadian visitors employed roughly 6% fewer workers than comparable businesses in less exposed markets. Surveys by Lalaya and Longwoods International found that 59 to 62% of Canadians said U.S. government policies and rhetoric made them significantly less likely to visit. YouGov data commissioned by Flight Centre Canada indicated 62% of Canadians said they were less likely to visit the U.S. in 2026. Airlines adapted, restructuring entire route networks. Air Transat eliminated all U.S.-bound flights by June 2026. WestJet cut U.S. capacity by 19%. Canadian overseas travel rose over 5% year over year, with Mexico and Europe capturing what had once been American vacation spending. Washington's 50% steel tariff blowback now faced a response described by Canadian industry leaders as economically unfeasible. Canada's counter arrived as a coordinated political and diplomatic strategy. Alignment with Mexico, a new advisory committee, a public rebuke from the Prime Minister, and a civilian consumer base redirecting billions in spending away from American businesses for over a year, with no reversal in sight. U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer said he did not expect USMCA negotiations to conclude by July 1st, the deadline to extend the deal 16 more years. Missing that window would trigger a decade of annual reviews before the agreement could end entirely. Any partner could withdraw with 6 months' notice. Meanwhile, the offer sent to Canadian steel companies was framed as relief. Industry leaders called it unfeasible. The Prime Minister called it a violation. Trade data showed it was too late for the 14,000 Canadian workers the government claimed it had already protected through domestic intervention. The $4.5 billion in lost American tourism revenue, empty campgrounds, shuttered border shops, and reduced airline capacity were all consequences of consumer behavior damaged by political choices, beyond the reach of any tariff relief program. The question was no longer whether Canadian companies would accept the deal. They would not. The real question was whether Washington had a plan when its pressure strategy produced defiance instead of compliance, and when that defiance translated into American employment losses, reduced business revenue, and suffering border towns. 72 hours after the offer, no credible answer had emerged.